Bundys Garage, Bundy here. Hey, today we're working on a 2008 Acura TL Type S, 3.5 liter, but you'll also find this in the Accords, your Odysseys, your Ridgelines, your Pilots, your TLs, your CLs, your MDXs, your Cross Tours. Putting the lower intake manifold back on, just clean the two gaskets there and put the lower intake manifold closest to the radiator on. You torque these down to 16 foot-pounds and just putting in the two bolts. On the front, in the front lower intake, there are 5 nuts and bolts. I believe there's 3 bolts and 2 nuts. You torque them down to 16 foot-pounds. There's 2, so right there you're seeing on the driver's side, there's 2 bolts right next to each other, so don't forget those when you're taking it off, and don't forget them when you're putting them back on. And there's one on the passenger side, and then you'll see 2 nuts that go into the studs. So it's not really hard. You can't really torque the lower intake manifold that sits closest to the firewall because the existing lower intake manifold is already in place, and there's no way to get a torque wrench in there for your 2 nuts. So when I tighten those down, I just do it by feel. It's not very much. It's only 16 foot-pounds. You can do the 2 nuts or 2 bolts that are on the outside of the lower intake manifold towards the firewall, but not so much for the nuts. So right there I'm torquing it down. That should sit nice and flush when you're doing it. So right here I'm putting in the guide pins. There's 2 aluminum guide pins. I like to put them into the head first and then bring in the lower intake manifold. Make sure that they come out when you pull the lower intake manifold as well. But yeah, just lining everything up, lining up the 2 studs, and then lining up the guide pins. Once you have that in place, you'll be able to start putting on the 2 nuts and the 2 bolts. Like I said, you can torque the outermost bolts to 16 foot-pounds, which I'm showing you right here. I had to move the power steering pump to get access to this. It just makes it a little bit easier to gain. Actually, makes it a lot easier to gain access to the bolts that need to come out to remove it and to put them back on. This is a 12 millimeter. I'm just having an extension there that I use to tighten it back up. There I'm just using the wrench to tighten them down. Then had to use a 10 millimeter socket to get that one. Here I'm just putting some towels, some rags, whatever I can find, some used gloves into the intake so that nothing falls down there and gets into the cylinders. Right here I'm using some Mobil 1 synthetic grease on the oil tube seals, oil tube plugs. I just coat the inside of the valve cover where they sit, and I also coat the plug itself, the oil tube gasket as well. It just makes it going that much easier. A good trick to do is put these in your freezer for 3 or 4 days before you do the job. Let them shrink down a little bit, and then they go in nice and easy. Sometimes these are real beasts to get out. I've had to burn them off with a propane torch before, but just get underneath them with a big screwdriver, pop them out. If your valve cover is rock hard, it's also a good idea to replace it at this time as well. That's what I'm doing right here. You want the valve cover gasket to be a nice soft rubber. You do not use any RTV on this gasket. I know on the 4 cylinders you can use RTV in the corners that goes over the distributor and some other places, but on the V6s I never use any RTV or gasket maker on the valve cover seals. So just getting that back into place. Just make sure that the oil tube seals go over the oil tubes. When you install them, it's better to leave them a little bit high than flushed all the way down into the valve cover gasket, or into the valve cover, because if you push them all the way down to the bottom of the valve cover, if you have them bottom out, usually it leaves room for oil to seep past see past and get beyond the oil tube seals. You'll see when you get in what makes sense. I also coat the oil tubes, all 3 of them, actually all 6 of them, the ones on the front and ones on the back. I coat them with the synthetic grease as well, the Mobil 1 synthetic grease, just so everything goes on nice and easy. So here I'm just running them down. There's a torque spec for them, but in my experience, it's best just to snug these down. You don't have to be Superman and tighten them down. They will bottom out eventually. They're only so tall, so I just tighten them down until they bottom out and leave them at that. So working on the front part of the head, just getting the surface clean. I've already prepped everything on this valve cover, so I'm not going to bore you with that, but just putting it into place. I use a mirror here on the front and the back just to make sure that the valve cover gasket hasn't rolled over on itself, because if that happens to you, you're going to experience a pretty bad oil leak if it rolls over, if the valve cover gasket rolls over on you. So here I'm just putting in the 5 bolts. Once again, I just snug them down. There's a torque spec, but I just snug them down until they bottom out. Okay, now I'm bringing in the fuel injectors, all 6 fuel injectors, getting some new oil. I'm going to coat the O-rings on all 6 injectors and into the holes that they go into. Just putting in the oil down there as well, so it makes it slide in nice and easy. Just push them into place. You usually don't need to replace the O-rings on the fuel injectors unless they're ripped or torn or missing or damaged somehow. Right here I'm just slowing it down so I can show you that there's a bolt. There's 4 bolts that go in, 2 bolts on each fuel rail. They're 8mm. You can see right there where they go. Just take your time. These can be kind of a pain to get in. The front ones are always easier than the rear ones, just because you can see a lot better from the front. I'm going to show you here a trick in a second on how to get the bolt started if you're having problems with the rear one, or the front one for that matter. So when they're not staying in place, I'll just take a piece of paper towel or toilet paper or a napkin, push the bolt in with the piece of tissue, and it holds it in place. You can see right there. And then I'll drive in the 2 rear bolts, the 2 8mm bolts into the fuel rail to secure the fuel rail. You do not want to leave the fuel injector rail without the bolts in place, or it will pop out. And don't ask me how I know that. So right here, just click in the, bring in the electrical connectors for the fuel injectors. Right here, I'm showing you there's a bolt for the, the knock sensor. It's just a 10mm bolt that you need to tighten down. And then the wiring harness that the fuel injectors use, there's a 10mm bolt that sits on top of the engine mount that you need to replace. And then I'm plugging in the knock sensor right there. And then those 2 sensors and that hose go into the upper intake manifold. Just making sure that all the connectors are in with the fuel injectors, and they're good to go. Right here, I'm just installing the power steering pump. 2 12mm bolts hold that thing in. The easiest way I've found to install this thing or to remove it is to use a quarter-inch ratchet with a 12mm socket. That's the best, and that's the easiest and most reliable way that I've found to remove the power steering pump or install it. So just tightening everything up right there. The last power steering bolt on the back. And then the ground wire right there as well. Okay, so I pull all my old gloves out and rags and everything else, and just putting the upper intake manifold gasket on. Putting the upper intake manifold on. Then it has bolts and nuts that you put down into place. It is a they are 12mm bolts and nuts. Just putting the 2 nuts on. Oh yeah, I had to take this thing back off because I wanted to make sure that the wiring harness for the fuel injectors was actually in place. There's 4 clips that hold it in place, and I had forgotten to put those in place, so I had to pop it off real quick, and then I start putting everything back in. So just driving down the nuts and bolts right here on the upper intake manifold. Then I'll come in here, and there's a torque spec for it. I'll put that up. It was right there, but I'll slow that down for a second. 16 foot-pounds, and you just follow the torque sequence. Not hard at all. Then you have a front cover that you need to put on, just attaching the power steering pump. I didn't show you guys the driver's side of this, or I actually haven't done it yet, where I put the throttle body back on, the snorkel. Let me know in comments below if you want me to show you how to do that. It's not really hard. It's not really hard to do that at all. I just didn't get it. I just didn't get to it in this video. But hey, I hope you guys like this format. Sorry I didn't go over each specific nut and bolt and the size, but figured this will give you a good overview of what to do on how to get the upper or lower intake manifolds back together. I'll put a link in the description to some other J-Series videos that I've done, or a lot of the J-Series videos that I've done. Just trying to save you guys money by being able to do this work yourself. It's not really hard. It just takes some time and patience, and anybody can do this. It's not really hard at all. So if you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to Bundys Garage, and hope you guys like this. If you guys like this format, let me know below, and I'll be sure to do more of these. Hope everybody's staying safe with this coronavirus going around, but take it easy, guys.